Okay, so Monday, December 29th, 2025. If you were tracking geopolitical news over the holidays, you definitely saw the spike.
Oh, yeah, it was hard to miss.
An emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council. And, usually when that happens so fast, you're thinking missile launch, a coup, something big.
Something kinetic.
This time, it was about a signature on a piece of paper.
A very, very controversial signature. We're talking about Israel officially recognizing Somaliland as an independent state.
And the reaction, it wasn't just a ripple. It felt more like a tidal wave. I mean, you had ambassadors almost shouting about the end of international order, resolutions being drafted in a panic. It was just diplomatic chaos.
It really was.
Yeah.
And if you stripped away all the polite language, the message from the UN, from the African Union, it was basically identical.
Right.
They were all arguing that Somaliland is an inseparable part of Somalia. The whole narrative is that this recognition, it opens a Pandora's box, it violates the UN Charter, destroys a nation's territorial integrity.
And that is the standard line, right? It's what we've all sort of been taught to believe about the Horn of Africa for, 30 years now?
For a long time, yeah.
But today, we're doing a deep dive into a document that basically says, wait a minute, you're looking at this entire map upside down.
Exactly. The source material for today is a document titled Somaliland and Djibouti.docx. And honestly, it's a fascinating read because it doesn't just argue for Somaliland's independence. It effectively puts the entire international community on trial for hypocrisy.
That's a bold thesis.
Yeah.
The document claims the world is selectively ignoring history. But it goes further, arguing that the key to solving this whole crisis, it isn't in Mogadishu, and it's not even in Hargeisa. It's in a tiny strategic country right next door, Djibouti.
And this is the real aha moment in the text. It suggests that recognizing Somaliland, it doesn't destroy Somali unity. In fact, it uses Djibouti as the case study and argues that two Somali states coexisting is maybe the only way to actually stabilize the region.
So that's our mission today. We're going to unpack this whole thing. We'll look at the legal argument for restoration, not secession, the surprising role of Djibouti, and what this source calls a new model for unity.
That's good.
Let's start with the history, because the document accuses the UN of convenient amnesia. What exactly are they forgetting?
They're forgetting or, maybe choosing to ignore the year 1960. If you listen to the speeches from that UN meeting, the implication is always that Somaliland is some kind of breakaway province.
A rebellious teenager running away from home.
That's the idea they're selling.
Yeah, secession. That's the scary word they throw around. Breaking off a piece of an existing country.
But our source points out this crucial technicality. Somaliland isn't trying to secede. It's trying to restore a status it already legally held.
Okay, walk us through that timeline, because 1960, that's the big year of independence for so much of Africa. What exactly happened in the Horn?
It is, and the sequence the source emphasizes is really important. So on June 26, 1960, the British Protectorate of Somaliland gets its independence. It becomes a sovereign state.
A full-on country.
A full-on country. It was recognized by 35 other countries, including some members of the Security Council.
So for a moment there, it was a standalone country on the map. It had its own flag, its own seat at the table, so to speak.
Exactly, for 5 days.
5 days.
Then on July 1st, the former Italian Somalia gets its independence. And on that very same day, the two entities decide to unite. They form the Somali Republic.
So it wasn't that Somaliland was born as part of Somalia? There were two separate countries that agreed to get married?
That is the perfect analogy. It was a voluntary union, two sovereign states joining forces.
Mm-hmm.
But the source argues that this marriage, well, it had a fatal flaw from the start.
How so?
It wasn't ratified properly. There were legal corners cut. But maybe more importantly, the marriage eventually turned abusive and just completely collapsed.
You're referring to the Civil War in the late 80s.
The Civil War, the brutal bombing of Hargeisa, the genocide committed by the Siad Barre regime against the people in the north, the state just disintegrated. By 1991, the central government in Mogadishu had completely ceased to exist.
So the logic here is, if the marriage fails and the house burns down, you don't stay married to the ashes.
Essentially, yes. The source frames this as a lawful restoration of sovereignty. When the union collapsed, Somaliland simply reverted to the independent status it held on June 26, 1960.
That's a critical distinction for anyone listening.
Okay.
Because secession terrifies the international community. It just implies chaos.
It does.
Restoration sounds more like correcting a historical filing error.
And the source draws this very sharp line between what it calls political fictions and functional realities.
Oh, okay.
The political fiction is the map on the wall at the UN that shows one big Somalia. The source basically calls that a fantasy. It says we're pretending a government exists where one, for all practical purposes, just doesn't.
And the functional reality is what's actually been happening on the ground in Somaliland for, what, over 30 years now?
Exactly. But before we get to that part, the governance, I want to stick with this one Somalia argument because that's the real emotional core of the opposition, the whole idea of pan-Somalism. One people, one language, one religion, so they must be one country.
It's a powerful idea. I mean, you look at history, divided people usually want to be together. Germany, Vietnam, it feels intuitive that people who speak the same language should share a passport.
It does feel intuitive, but the source just throws a giant wrench in that logic. It basically says, okay, if you truly believe that all Somali people must be in one state, then what do you do about Djibouti?
This was the part of the document that really made me stop and think. I think most of us know Djibouti as that place with all the foreign military bases, but I hadn't really connected the ethnic dots.
It's the smoking gun of this entire argument. Djibouti used to be French Somaliland. It got its independence in 1977. But, I mean, look at the demographics. The source points out that Djibouti has an Isa Somali majority,
And the Isa clan is.
a major Somali clan. And crucially, this clan straddles the border. The people in Djibouti share deep cultural, linguistic, and, blood ties with the people in Somaliland. The source calls these bonds lived realities. We're not talking distant cousins here. We're talking about the same families.
Okay, so if the argument against Somaliland is you can't have two Somali states because it divides the people, Djibouti is standing right there waving and saying, hello, I've been here since 1977.
Precisely. That is the inconsistency the author is just hammering on over and over. Djibouti acts as an independent state. It has a seat at the UN. It has embassies, a flag, and yet nobody accuses Djibouti of destroying Somali unity.
Right. Had to stop being Somali just because it has a different border.
Not at all. It maintains its Somali character perfectly well. So the source asks a very simple question. If Djibouti proves that a Somali-led state can coexist and thrive right next to Somalia, why is Somaliland treated so differently?
It really does seem like a massive double standard. We treat Djibouti's borders as sacred international law, but we treat Somaliland's borders as these imaginary lines, even though the cultural dynamics are almost identical.
The source argues it's purely political convenience. The world accepts Djibouti because of its colonial history with France, but it rejects Somaliland because they are terrified of the precedent it might set for the rest of Africa.
The fear that if you redraw one border, every single separatist movement on the continent will suddenly want their own country.
The balkanization fear. But the source has a counter to that, too. It says, look, we aren't redrawing a border. We are just acknowledging the old colonial border that everyone already agreed to back in 1960.
And frankly, looking at Djibouti, it hasn't exactly caused the region to implode. The document calls it a diplomatic hub.
Right. Djibouti is stable. It's a strategic partner to the U.S., China, France. Pretty much everyone has a base there. So the logic follows. If Djibouti proves that a separate Somali state can be stable, successful, and a good global citizen, why are we automatically assuming Somaliland would be a disaster?
It completely flips the script. It goes from separation causes chaos to separation actually allows for stability.
Exactly. And speaking of stability, that brings us to the next section of the document, the track record. Because, you can have all the historical arguments you want, all the legal theories, but if your country is a mess on the ground, nobody's going to recognize you.
That's the whole earned sovereignty idea. How does the text describe what's actually happening inside Somaliland? We hear so many horror stories out of Somalia, proper piracy, al-Shabaab, famine.
The source paints a picture of just stark contrast. It describes Somaliland as a kind of oasis in a very, very rough neighborhood. It just lists the achievements, maintaining peace for over 3 decades, holding multiple democratic elections.
With peaceful transfers of power, right?
Yeah.
Which is not common in the region.
Exactly. Peaceful transfers, building functioning institutions.
And functioning institutions, you mean like police, courts, tax collection, that kind of thing?
All of it. They have their own currency, the Somaliland shilling. They issue their own passports, even if travel is, difficult. They have a parliament. And the author emphasizes one key detail. They did all of this without international recognition and, crucially, without any external military intervention.
And that is a huge dig at the alternative. Because everyone knows the government in Mogadishu relies on billions of dollars in foreign aid
Yeah.
and thousands of African Union peacekeepers just to hold the capital city.
Precisely. The source calls the forced union with Somalia a failed political fiction. It says the international community is spending billions trying to prop up a government in Mogadishu that struggles to even govern its own city, while at the same time they're ignoring a government in Hargeisa that is actually governing effectively on its own dime.
It's like punishing the student who gets straight A's without a tutor, while forcing them to do the homework for the student who's failing, even with 5 private teachers.
That's a harsh analogy, but it definitely aligns with the tone of the text. The author argues that international law should value things like effective governance and consent of the governed. And when people demonstrate clear consent through referendums and elections, and they demonstrate decades of stability, international law should probably recognize that reality.
But let's play devil's advocate for a second. The international community, they're not blind. They see this stability. Why are they so stubborn? Is it really just that slippery slope fear?
It's that for sure, but it's also the African Union's very strict adherence to uti possidetis, the principle that you keep the borders you got at independence.
Right.
They're terrified that if they let Somaliland go, maybe Ethiopia might fracture, or Nigeria. But the source argues that by denying Somaliland, they're actually making the region less safe.
How so?
Because you're forcing two entities together that clearly do not want to be together, and that just creates friction, it creates conflict. The source contends you can't build a stable house on a foundation of coercion.
Which brings us to the solution, the new model for unity. Because the source isn't just complaining about the problem, it's actually proposing a path forward.
It is. And this is where the vision gets pretty broad. It's not arguing for isolationism. It's not saying Somaliland should build a wall and ignore everyone else. It's arguing for something it calls Somali cooperation.
Unity through separation. It sounds a little paradoxical.
In a way, yeah. But think about, say, the European Union. You have distinct sovereign nations cooperating on trade, security, travel. The source envisions a future where Somaliland, Djibouti, and Somalia are all independent anchors of a new regional bloc.
And this brings us right back to Djibouti. The title of the document mentioned Djibouti can lead the way. We started this by talking about Israel recognizing Somaliland, but the author seems to think Djibouti's recognition matters a whole lot more. Why is that?
It's all about optics and legitimacy. If Israel or the UK or the US recognizes Somaliland, critics can just dismiss it as a neo-colonial plot.
Right.
They can say it's outsiders trying to divide and conquer the Somali people.
And that divide and rule narrative is so strong in that part of the world. And honestly, given the history, you can kind of understand why people are suspicious of outside powers meddling.
Exactly. But if Djibouti recognizes Somaliland, you can't call that foreign meddling. Djibouti is a Somali majority state. The source argues its recognition would be an affirmation of Somali self-determination.
It changes the narrative from betrayal to brotherhood.
That is the core argument. The text says recognizing Somaliland is not a betrayal of Somali identity. It envisions Somaliland and Djibouti as natural partners, bound by history, blood, and destiny.
History, blood, and destiny. It's quite a phrase.
It is. The author is painting a picture of a future that's based on mutual respect, not coercion. If Djibouti steps up, it provides political cover for other African nations, maybe Kenya or Ethiopia, to follow suit. It breaks the taboo.
Because right now, it feels like everyone is waiting for someone else to jump first. Israel jumped, but they're seen as an outsider. Djibouti is an insider.
Correct. The source is effectively challenging Djibouti to use its diplomatic weight. It's saying, look, you are a hub. You have the ear of world powers. Use that influence to validate your brother nation.
It's a very pragmatic take. It's basically saying, look, the toothpaste is out of the tube. It's been out for 35 years. Let's stop trying to put it back in. Let's just buy a second tube and put them next to each other on the shelf.
The two-tube solution. I like it. But seriously, it envisions normalization. If Somaliland is recognized, it can engage with Mogadishu as an equal. They can sign trade deals, coordinate on security, share intelligence on al-Shabaab. Right now, they can't do that effectively because Mogadishu still claims jurisdiction over them.
So recognition allows the conversation to shift from who owns this land to, okay, how do we work together?
Precisely. It moves the dynamic from a frozen conflict to just regular international diplomacy. It's about being pragmatic neighbors instead of angry roommates locked in an endless dispute.
It is a compelling argument, especially when you think about that Security Council meeting. While all the diplomats in New York are reading the strict letter of the UN Charter, This author is pointing at the map and saying, just look at the lived reality.
And that really is the tension of international relations, isn't it? The constant clash between legal theory and the facts on the ground. This document is a plea to prioritize the reality.
It definitely makes you look at the Horn of Africa differently. Instead of seeing one broken country, you start to see the potential for a network of cooperating states. A Benelux of the Horn, maybe?
That's the dream, I think. A network of stability rather than a single, large, failing state.
So, as we sign off today, I want to leave you, the listener, with the philosophical question that this source really raises. We use the word unity all the time, as if it's inherently good. We always want to unify countries, unify people.
It's a buzzword that we just assume is positive.
But this deep dive really challenges that assumption. The question this document leaves us with is this. If unity has to be maintained by force, or by ignoring the expressed will of millions of people, is it really unity at all?
Or is true unity only possible when distinct sovereign entities choose to hold hands?
And maybe the strongest handshake is between two people standing on their own 2 feet, rather than one person trying to hold the other one down.
That's a very provocative thought to end on.
Something to mull over the next time you see a map of East Africa. Thanks for listening to this deep dive.
Until next time.
See you then.